So thank you all for joining us for today's virtual Lunch and Learn. My name is Aaron Perry-Zucker, and I'm the Marketing and Communications Director here at Center for Nonprofit Management. And we have loved hosting these conversations throughout the pandemic. It's been a really great way to stay in touch with everyone. The topic today is the changing role of the board in uncertain times. And we're very pleased to be joined by Carolyn Williams, who's going to talk about her experience from both sides of the aisle on the executive team and on boards. And Regina will be introducing her in just a minute. But before we dive in, just want to go over a little bit of housekeeping. Want to make sure that everybody is aware of all the resources that we at CNM have. Let's see, making sure my screen go black. Hopefully it's still visible here. Somebody wave your hands if you can't see my screen, but should be good here. Looks like the color changed. Okay. So yeah, I want to make sure that everyone knows the resources that we've got here at CNM for you, including the ability to hop on and speak with any of our expert in-house consultants at any time. You can schedule free 15-minute sessions, all from our website. We also have a full lineup of our virtual seminars and certificate programs that are still rocking. And I'll be going over some of those in just a second, as well as our continually updating page of COVID resources specifically for nonprofits. All on our website. Some of our upcoming sessions, we just announced our October lineup, but next week we've got a seminar on strengthening virtual donor relationships. You know, everyone's been struggling to stay in touch with their donors during these distant times. Looks like we lost Regina and she's coming back. Also starting in October, we've got a new session of Supervising for Success. One of our regular programs, super popular, always fills up. And then on the 7th, we're starting with a new session that we're trying called Managing Differences Through Mediation. Lots of other opportunities to check out as well, including a really cool certificate program on grant writing and grant seeking starting at the end of the month. So please go check out on our website at cnmsocal.org/events. Last up here, just want to make sure that we're setting some norms for the session today. You know, this is a conversation. This is about learning. We will be recording this session so that everybody can, you know, see what's going on here if they weren't able to make it. So if there's anything, you know, confidential and private, probably don't want to say it publicly here. But also, you know, just make sure to take care of yourself. Please keep yourself on mute when you're not talking, but you're welcome to unmute yourself to ask questions. We'd love to see your faces on video, but definitely not required. And, you know, in general, just be respectful of everyone else and keep an open mind. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Regina, who is going to introduce our poll and our guest speaker for today. So Regina, want to kick it off?
I do. Hi, everybody. Happy Friday. It's good to see you. And because we know this is about boards and the only healthy way to handle these conversations is to make sure you get to say what you need to say, we're also going to do some breakout time where that will not be recorded. So you have an opportunity to vent if you need to without it being public. So, you know, we do these working lunch sessions to make sure that, number one, we get to see each other and try and solve, address, talk about whatever it is that's going on in your week that's most important. And one of the topics, as everybody's dealing with so much distress, is working effectively with your board and trying to be as clear as you can be with them about what you need and what you don't need. So we thought that we would ask a woman who has been on boards for a long time, who's also been on the corporate philanthropy side, and also coached a lot of people, executives in the nonprofit space. So she's seen it from lots of different places. So we are really glad, happy, and proud, because Carolyn's on our board, to have Carolyn Williams with us today. And it's our chance to sort of peek behind the curtain about where board members might be thinking differently than we are. And then where she's seen some things work well and some things that haven't worked so well. Thinking about the recession, think about the current times, and then all those board meetings in between. So Carolyn, welcome.
Thank you. Hi, everybody.
So we're going to ask, just so that we all kind of get in the room and think about what is most meaningful to you guys, we're going to do a couple of poll questions. And then, as Erin mentioned, feel free to put stuff in the chat. We'll keep an eye on it. And then we will ask Carolyn questions, or you can raise your hand and you can ask Carolyn questions. So the idea here is to not have it be a presentation, but a conversation. So Erin, should we put up the first question and hear from these guys?
Yes, and actually, since we talked, I condensed them into one poll just for expedience sake. So I'm going to launch our poll right now. Basically, we want to get a sense of, what kind of conversations are you having with your board? So you can select more than one of these answers, but I'm curious, is your board talking about the impact of the pandemic, calls for racial equity, fundraising, scenario planning, stress, growing needs, everything? I was going to add an all of the above option, but also if there's anything that's not on this list, we'd love to hear about it. Please include anything in the chat. I'm going to leave this open for another few seconds. Lots of votes are coming in, so thank you. It's going to give us a good little snapshot of where everyone's boards are at right now. It's going to give us about another 10 seconds. We're nearing 100% completion, so thank you for being fast on those buttons there. All right, looking like we're slowing down and just about got everybody. So thank you for voting, and let's share back these results. Not super surprising, but a lot of people looking at fundraising, 89%, with 82% behind that at the impact of the pandemic, 61 at calls for racial equity, and then about 30 to 40 on everything else, scenario planning, stress on your staff, and responding to growing community needs. So not super surprising, but Carolyn, hopefully that gives you a good sense of the room as you jump off here. And I'm going to mute myself as an ambulance is coming.
There's something poetic about that. So Carolyn, their top, I'm curious, when you see that first line being fundraising, I'm really curious if it means that boards are talking about fundraising or doing fundraising. And I'm curious, Carolyn, over your time, you've seen some very successful organizations engage their boards in fundraising. So are there some takeaways that you might share about how to help get your board engaged in fundraising and kind of what they're thinking about and why sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't?
Yeah,
to get them involved.
When I even thought about it and I made a list, fundraising came to the top of my list too. Because it's always there, but fundraising currently in the pandemic is so different. I'm currently serving on 4 boards. I'm a founding board chair for one in my second year. Well, actually, going in my 3rd year for that organization. I'm in a number of organizations. One's an art organization. I'm on the center, and I work with another group that's creating a nonprofit. So that's a whole different, issue. As a board member, where do we go? But fundraising continues to be an issue. One board I'm on, where the executive director wanted to go was to ask each board member to commit at a certain level. Sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't work, because it was give or get. And for this particular board, it was $10,000. I've been on other boards where it asks the boards to participate and to be able to give at the level that they're comfortable with. And I've done some coaching with executive directors who say we can't even get our board to give $100. So, it's that issue that's out there. But what I've found that works is bringing the board in for that conversation. Because sometimes, like the one that said, we're going to ask everybody for $10,000. That was a decision made by the executive director. And not a conversation with the board. We have some critical issues, but one of the things that's driving that particular executive director is a program that he wants to do. I think it's great. It puts a lot of pressure on the board, The board is stepping up, but part of what we're trying to look at is how do we bring a board together to, to look at the priorities. And while that's the priority program for the executive director, I don't think the whole board is in agreement. We're going along with it, but I don't think the whole board is in agreement because there are other things that we're trying to do. So what we have as a board, we've created. In fact, this is a very new board, but we've created the committees that we're looking at. How do we go about doing what we're doing? And as I look, I'm on Facebook. There are a lot of virtual fundraisers. One organization that I used to chair, they're doing a virtual fundraiser, but what they're doing is we're bringing together all the executive directors. I mean, all the former board chairs as a committee. They're doing a lot of Zoom meetings and coaching people on how we're going to approach fundraising, because this is an organization that's had very successful events in the past. In fact, they net, when I first started with the group, the first one, in fact, I was there for the first gala, we were hoping to break even. Now they net $1 million. But now, as people start to do things differently, how do they meet the goals that they're trying to do? So now they're looking at how do we bring people together? How do we bring our supporters, our volunteers together to help us continue to meet the needs that we have? And they're not just talking about it, they're coaching people along. They're helping people form groups. They're helping them, they're providing all the things that they need to do the fundraising. And it's an interesting take because it keeps you engaged. They're holding like twice a week, every 2 weeks, we're having an opportunity to talk about how we're doing. And so they've created a larger community of volunteers, of supporters to help them reach the goal. They're doing some similar things that they've done in the past, like a silent auction, those types of things, which you can do virtually. But I think what's been creative about that is to use Zoom and to organize not just the board, but the volunteers of the organization to help do fundraising. Because fundraising continues to be a high priority for the board.
How did you, when you talk about sort of bringing the board along, I'm imagining that a lot of the EDs listening are going, that just sounds like a lot of time. And what do you, and it sounds like the idea of if the ED is saying, this is a priority for me, but the board isn't really buying in, they're kind of voting with their feet by not helping raise money, right? So how do you get that conversation to be constructive so that people on the board side that are doing other things with their day besides this job feel compelled to step up and help? Like, what made the difference?
Well, one of the things is to talk about why we're doing what we're doing, because in one sense, if you listen to, I think it's about packaging and how do you present it to the board, because it sounds like a pet project for the executive director, but then it's like, how do we repackage this so that the board members can get on board? It's not just about a pet project. It's allowing us to do the programs that we want to do. It's providing visibility for our organization. It's providing community support. It helps us do the programs that we want to do and outreach. And this organization is in the university. It provides some feedback and some growth for the university and allows it to continue to be seen as a community member that invests in the community. So some of that was to change the conversation and to not just, first of all, have the conversation with the executive director and talk about, maybe we need to talk about this in a different way. And how do we pull people in on this? Because a lot of times, sometimes the executive director is thinking strategically, but they're so far ahead of the board. So when the board finally comes in, we don't always have a chance to get caught up. So how do you get the executive director, the CEO to stop and bring the board along? And sometimes that's a conversation with the CEO and the board chair or a committee to say, whoa. Or even some conversations between board members to say what's happening, and maybe a conversation at a committee level to say we need to have another talk to the CEO or the ED to talk about how do we bring the board along. So sometimes it's just even helping the CEO who's so far ahead of us, because that's an everyday issue. They have to think ahead with bringing the board along. And what I found with one organization, we have to increase the amount of times we meet. We're meeting once a quarter. If you've got big goals as an organization and the board's meeting once a quarter, it's just hard for the board to even stay up, because every time we come into a board meeting, it's almost like, oh yeah, we talked about that the last time. So that's a perspective, and that's something. And for instance, this organization was looking at big goals. It's like, we've got to meet more often. We're not meeting enough. And we've got to get our committees cracking and helping, and even helping the committees become successful. So I hope, that's sort of a long answer, but it's a lot of moving pieces. And how do you stop and kind of bring the coordination together for all those moving pieces?
Right. Well, it's interesting. One of the things that we talk about sometimes is like having a guest or a client or something talk to your board to make it real, so it's a learning meeting instead of just a reporting out meeting. And I'm wondering if you found as a board member, if it helped it click for you, because we know at CNM, what I hear from a lot of board members is they write up these big things, but I don't read them all, or it makes sense to them, but it doesn't make sense to me. And the EDs will tell us, well, we told them 4 times, right? But they haven't heard it. So I'm wondering how to kind of tactically think about making it real for the board members and not have the ED just writing more stuff that people aren't really connecting with.
And one of the things I think for the ED or, the staff, they're communicating, but they don't realize all board members don't understand the work of the organization. I mean, it's you would think that, okay, they're on board and they're seeing these programs, but they really don't understand the programs. And when I was at the Center for Nonprofit, when I was at the Downturn Women's Center, one of the things I thought that we did well was each meeting, somebody would come in and talk about the program. They would bring the program to us so that we understood the impact of that program and what difference it's made. So we weren't just reading a report, because generally in a board meeting, there's so many things going on. When you talk about services, the board, they think they understand, but they didn't get it. So when we had a presentation from a particular service area to talk about what we're doing, the board could ask questions and start to understand. And on another board I'm on right now, all of the staff attends our board meetings, but it's a small staff. But they're able to talk about the work that they're doing so that we understand. When we say, give us an update, we don't want to hear just the flyover. We want to hear the issues that are happening out there. Where do we stand? How can we help? So it's bringing the board in, because again, even for the center, so one of our board members came in and said, gee, I finally understand what this is all about. And this, guys, what I'm talking about. It's been on the board for a number of years. And sometimes that contributes to why your board members are not supporting the organization as much as they could, because they don't always understand what you really do. They know that you're doing a broad range of services, but they still don't get it. So the other question is, how do you start to educate your board and help them understand what it is you do? And again, bringing somebody in, DWC was always great at that. We got it. We understood when you talked about, this is the first time we're doing this, why it's important. We were always on board with that. And we met, we weren't meeting once a we were meeting monthly.
I'm wondering then, does a committee then sort of take on the job of taking what they heard in those meetings and then turning it into a fundraising strategy? I'm wondering how it becomes actionable so that it gets to, we got to raise money to make this happen, and we need you guys to help with that. I'm curious how you get, I'm always struck by when we ask board members, they kind of give themselves a pretty high grade for being good board members. And when we ask EDs, they kind of get a C. It's really, there's a big difference in the grading.
Right. I think, well, one group I'm working with now, it's like a startup. The organization or the name has been in the community for 20 years. One person has run it, but now it's becoming a nonprofit. there's no staff. And what's happened is that by having a meeting, and we didn't have the whole board, but to be able to have the executive director, this person talk about her vision, we were able to understand. But also, as we kind of had this one meeting around a particular issue, we were able to understand the issue she was having. And so what was interesting, out of this board meeting, the whole board became a committee. And we've included other people, but it's been interesting because her complaint was that my board chair isn't working and this, but nobody really understood what she was trying to do. And even now, when we pull people together, I'm on the board, but I'm also acting sort of like a coach too, is to have her talk about what her vision is, what she's trying to do, so that we have the opportunity to get on board. But it was interesting, the whole board became a committee. But because I think board members don't always know how to help. They don't, I'm sorry. They want to, but sometimes you have to ask, you have to engage people and ask them directly, can you help us out? And I found even if it's a board chair but when people are asked, they're more than willing to help, but to ask them to just sit back, whoever wants to volunteer, sometimes that's just not enough.
Just be very concrete.
Yep.
Yeah. So that's a good segue to a question that came up in the chat, which is kind of the do's and don'ts of how you have a conversation about micromanaging versus governing, and how, everything that in the poll, as Aaron was putting that up, it occurred to me, some of these things, you're still talking about, we work for the board. We're asking them to do stuff in addition to the job and the life they have outside of our organization. And, right now around equity, it's hard. We're asking them to raise money right now when people are feeling uncomfortable sometimes because of the economy. And they want to help. And what we've heard from some groups is they're helping, but in ways that aren't helpful, So how do we help our board chair first and foremost, and then communicate better about what's helpful and what's not, in terms of getting into the weeds, getting into micromanaging, being good, helpful, constructive board members at a time when people do want to help?
Right.
Are there some tips?
Yeah,
Do's and don'ts?
I kept thinking when you said that, sometimes working with a board is almost like, herding cats. There's one over here, or I watch Rawhide. I like the old Westerns, and Rawhide is about herding these beeves, as they call it, to market. And there's one over here, and sometimes they say, okay, let that one go because it's not worth it. Or sometimes they're trying to round up these beef and keep them headed in a particular direction. And I'm going to use this example. One board member, who was the founding board member of this organization, had retired, and he would show up in the office. He really wanted to be helpful, but the executive director said to me, he's driving us nuts. We don't know how to deal with him because he really wants to help, but he's driving us nuts. And so it was a matter of her having a conversation with him, because he retired, he was well known in his field, he didn't know how to help. So he would go in and just kind of hang out around the organization all day. So they had to let him know, or find a constructive way. So
was that like board peer-to-peer conversation where somebody had to tell the chair, tell this guy to stop doing that? Or that seems like it could be awkward.
It was awkward, but I think it was a board member who also had the conversation with the executive director. So it was two people. So it wasn't exactly on the board chair, not the board, yeah, but it wasn't exactly on the ED to say, they have the conversation. So I think it was a board member and someone who knew him well, who could have a conversation. But it was interesting because all he wanted to do was help. But what I learned from that is, while I may want to help, I need to make sure that my helping is really helping. So I don't come and hang out by the center as much as I would love to, because people have the work to do. So that's why I said herding. Sometimes it's like herding cats. Sometimes, and now I'm back off. What's the question again?
Well, I was thinking about, how to have, I'm just really struck by how we can help executive directors have conversations with their boards. And we know that there are board members that are getting in the weeds and micromanaging, and that's an awkward thing to do, right? To say, please go away, please don't help with this.
Right.
And then there's the kind of magical part, which is the peer-to-peer between board members, where if they talk to each other, that would get us out of the awkward conversation, but it means that we'd have to be able to communicate with a board member to say, can you talk to this guy? This isn't working for me, you know?
Right.
And really kind of almost that chess game, right? Of who the relationships are, where the influence is, like how to help people who are already stressed out,
Right.
to say, you know, somebody on the board handle this guy, right? I'm acting like it's a guy, but in the chat says, is there a new model to create an honorary board where we can park some people, keep them engaged, give them something to do? I keep thinking that at the beginning of this whole dramatic pandemic, one of the things that I learned from my friend at Board Source was, over the first weekend in March, we were talking the week of the 17th, and she said that her board chair said, tell me what you want me to do and tell me what you don't want me to do. And that really struck me, that it's on us to say the words, this is what would be so helpful. And this is really what won't be. And then if you have a good relationship with your board chair, to be able to say, now I need you to carry that message to your peers on the board, you know.
Right.
And it may change, right? What I need right now may be different in December, right?
Right.
But to also to be able to say, you know, we're in this together. Let's do the stuff where I need your help, you know.
Right.
So, and so there's that relationship thing. One of the things that came up in the chat, another awkward conversation, which is about succession planning. And it didn't come up as a top of the list on the poll, but I know that it comes up as everyone's kind of thinking about the future. Have you seen it go well, these conversations between EDs and boards where they're thinking about this? Like, are there some lessons, ways to handle it well and not well?
That's a interesting topic, because I'm trying to think of when I've seen it go well. I've seen some fails. I mean, I've seen some major fails, unfortunately, whether it's organization being flat and there's not a second person or backup for the ED, and seeing some fails there, or whether I'm saying ED, which means CEO, or where the CEO, ED is leaving and you're trying to manage that situation. I know someone, Regina and I had a conversation, a founding executive director for a small organization is looking at how do you bring on someone, how does she replace herself? And really having that conversation. And succession planning is a tough one for an organization. And it's very different if it's founding ED or if it's someone who's come along to an organization that has a history. And another situation is when it's someone who's come along and been very successful as an ED, that has really built that organization at a certain level. Those are some of the biggest shoes to fill from my experience. And I've seen it take a number of, I hate to say fails, but a number of times to get it right, because it's hard, because you've got organization culture that's going on. You've got the staff, maybe staff turnover when an ED leaves. There are just a lot of things going on, and a lot of, hopefully you can pull somebody from within the organization. But many of the nonprofits that I've worked with, there isn't a viable candidate. And even trying to develop them, even if you get there, that person may leave. I've seen that happen. The person you thought would be your number two, somebody else grabs them up. So I'm trying to think, do I have any pearls of wisdom. I just think the board is, I've seen it where the board has been involved in helping to select, taking time. That tends to work, but it still felt, and maybe some of the ones where I felt it's been most successful is when an outside party came in, rather than the board trying to do it. Somebody with the experience of doing it rather than a board committee. That's my perspective when I've seen it work best.
You know, it's interesting that it, I find angst on both sides, that EDs aren't sure they want to bring it up because that might make people nervous, assuming it's planned, not an emergency comes up. And boards don't want to ask the question because they don't want the ED to think they're kicking them out. But that whole idea of being just kind of normalize the conversation about longer term planning is just good organizational health. One of the things that I'm not suggesting it's not awkward, but what's emerging in the chat, Carolyn, is COVID. That how do we, as the staff is stressed, really busy, how to communicate with the board that, you know, this is extraordinarily difficult right now. And then where they can maybe have to revisit expectations because so much is off the table and so many new responsibilities have emerged. There's just so much going on. Like how to have that conversation with your board in a constructive way. And then again, to ask for help. I mean, we just did this yesterday. In fact, we had our board meeting yesterday, you guys, and I was really struck by just after 2 hours of a lot of hard work, at the very end, they asked, how are you and your staff doing? And it opened up a whole different conversation about what, you know, the fear of the virus, just what happened with Breonna Taylor's situation, the worries about, are we keeping up with the needs of our clients, and any opportunity to take care of ourselves. And I'm curious, Carolyn, from a board perspective, how should EDs be talking about this stuff with their boards?
I think it's a conversation to be had. And a lot of times the board understands, but I think it's, I don't, whether it's having a conversation with the board chair and they bring it up, but we're dealing with some of the same issues as board members, as just people. We know we've had to pivot, working from home. People are having homeschool. They're doing this. They've got children at home. They're trying to work in a different environment. The team sense of a team is not there. This is from one of the people that I coach. She felt that she's working hard and the board's, her staff is not working as hard, but the staff is working in a different environment and she's not sure how does she even monitor the work that they're doing, or her expectations. She's having to adjust her expectations of her staff who work together as a team. So how are they doing that? From a board perspective, especially if you're in these Zoom meetings, we are concerned. So maybe, I don't know whether the board will bring it up, like for you, Regina, it's on our minds for the center, because members of our board are either running their own organizations, or they're if they may be an ED themselves, or they're part of another group. So it's a part of the conversation. So I would say, hopefully your board chair, I think I would ask this, or something for the board, the executive director to think about, is having a conversation with the board chair to keep them in the loop of what's happening with the staff. Because, you know, again, board chair, people leave, they're on the board, but they leave and they go back to another life. And they go back to everything that they're dealing with too. But to have that conversation as the head of your organization with your board chair is a good place to start. You know, even if they haven't brought it up, let's just say, I like to just have a conversation with how we're dealing with COVID right now and how it's impacting the staff. Because for me, it's like, how's everybody doing? But if you ask the folks, you know, you don't want to go and ask the staff directly unless you have that relationship, which we don't want to go there. But I think having a conversation with the board chair is a good place to start.
You know, the other side of that, and we've sure seen it with groups that we're working with, some board members have been impacted by COVID as well, right? They're stressed, their kids are homeschooled, their job went away, or they have too much to do. So it seems like this is kind of a two-way street in that we should also be asking, and maybe it's up to the board chair to check in. I know one of the groups we're working with, maybe 3 months ago, she literally called everybody on her board and said, we had plans for this fiscal year. What's the same and what's going to be different based on your situation? And some people were fine and ready to go and stay with it. And some said, thanks for asking because my business just fell apart or my family's falling apart.
Mm-hmm.
And they decided how to kind of balance out their expectations for the next year with that information in mind. But the thing that I so admired is that it was so transparent. It was kind of, this virus has just crossed every demographic. So let's not assume, let's ask.
Right.
And then let's decide together what we want to do with what we now know. And it might mean in some cases, I'm going to have to step off. My company just fell apart and you wanted me for my company and my company's closing or I just got laid off. In some cases, it was, we're just really busy.
Right.
And so I'm not going to be able to be as present as I wanted to be, or I don't have the brain space.
Right.
But what I really liked is it was at the individual level saying, what can we count on and what shouldn't we count on? So that there wasn't that frustration about how come people aren't showing up,
Well, even for me, I think I give generously to the nonprofit community, but with COVID, my priorities shift. So when someone says they need to give $10,000 or give or get, I want to give to, the food bank, or I want to give in some other areas that are coming up for me as a priority. So how do we even have the conversation from a board perspective to allow board members to be able to do some of those shifts or to talk about it, or how do we manage what we're doing? Like one of the programs that we really want to do, it's not going to happen right now because of COVID. So we want to keep the money flowing, but can we reduce the demand? Because when we're out there saying we want to raise money for this, and we're talking to funders and whomever, and it's not a priority, how do we manage that as a board and as an organization? And for me, I kind of struggle with it, to be honest, because, I have X amount of money I want to give, or even if I'm increasing, again, it's starting to compete with what I see as some critical needs in the community because of COVID. I mean, you're seeing it every day. People are laid off. How many people are in line for food? People who have middle class jobs, they're seeing Mercedes driving through, getting food. So it's impacted a lot of people in different ways. And how, as an organization, how sensitive are we to that with our board members being people who may be impacted? I know one organization, we were talking about COVID. I've had 2 tests. This person says she's had 2 tests. Or you may be dealing with your own issues. I'm negative, but those things come up, or you're ill, and that's not always communicated. So it's just a matter of how do we stay connected to those folks who want to be supported.
It's I'm so struck by what what seems so common sense and obvious that isn't always obvious, but not to assume at this point, right? Anything, right? What your staff is dealing with, what your board is dealing with, what's happening in your community that we couldn't have anticipated in February or March. That we didn't know about social distancing. We didn't know about PPE or PPP 6 months ago. The learning curve to move things remotely and keep people safe has been intense. But I'm also struck by, I think what everybody was kind of asking is, how do we have these conversations and not have it feel like a burden, and then keep something constructive coming out of this? Are there any when you really look back at decades of being an active board member, are there some examples where you thought they're really doing it right? Like when the organization was working on all cylinders, the communication was going both ways, it really kept the board members engaged. I mean, we got through a recession, we've been through all kinds of unrest in LA. I mean, there were times when that really motivated boards to say, this is the time to find a way to step up. What was the secret sauce? Is there anything that you thought, boy, you know, they really did it right?
I can think of one in particular. I'll give the example, Downtown Women's Center. We had just completed our strategic planning. We knew what we didn't want to do, where we were headed for the next 3 to 5 years. And then they sold the property where we were located. So all of a sudden, everything we had decided to do was thrown up in the air. So now we got to switch gears. But what we did, first of all, we had to admit we didn't know what to do. So we found a way to get everybody involved. We had a small board, but we went back to former board members, and I think that's something that the Downtown Women's Center does very well. They're involved. They're in touch with founding board members. They're in touch with past board members, and they keep them engaged. But for that particular one, we were pulling in resources. We had pro bono services, people stepping up. But one of the things we always were telling ourselves, we're not sure how we're going to do it, but we were committed to getting it right and just plugging along. And as we were talking to people, a lot of what we've done with the Center for Nonprofit Management, we talked to people to try to find out what we didn't know. But everybody had a role. As I remember, everybody was on a committee. We were reporting out. The committee did its work in between. It was not doing the work at a board meeting, but we were all engaged, and it was like a little train that could. And we had an executive director and a staff. So if you're doing it alone, I think it's even tougher. But we had a small staff, but as we started to do that, we were able to identify resources that could help us, or somebody could make a connection. Somebody would make a referral. I know this person who you might want to speak to. So those things were happening, but we had to kind of get beyond ourselves, and we had to ask for help. And we went back to a lot of some key people were the people who've been there before us to say, we need some help. Can you open up some doors? But this is where we are right now. And I think for some organizations, asking for help is almost like, oh my God. But I think keeping some of your former people involved, like former board chairs don't know how to support the organization, I find. And one of the things we've talked about at least for me, for Downtown Women's Center, is bringing the former board chairs together in a way to support the organization. Right now, they like to do financial, which is fine, but how do you keep them engaged? Because they've given a lot in terms, they are committed to the organization. They support it, they believe in it. So how do you keep them engaged? So some of it is just, how do you reach out? But again, it was something happened that made us, our game, we were off our game, and we got to come together as a group we were like in survival mode. But everybody stepped up. But we almost demanded that everybody be a part of it and have a role. This is what
was it peer-to-peer, or was it, I'm curious if, like, I've seen some executive directors really just call every board member and say, I want to understand what you're interested in. Here's some things where we could use some help. Where can you step up? Or was it more like board groups peer-to-peer talking to each other, or like?
For me, I always believe in a strong executive team for an organization. Your officers being engaged and being able to help and being like a think tank for the executive director and the board chair. So if you don't, to me, that's my preference. Anytime I'm there, I'm looking for an executive team that really understands what's happening. And so as a team, that group stepped up to say, how do we get people engaged? So from there it became peer-to-peer, but it wasn't just the board meeting. Our executive team got together and say, what do we need to do? How we're going to do this? So it started as like a brain trust to say how we're going to move together. But that's my preference even now. in the organization where I'm a founding board chair is trying to create that executive team to help us plan and work together and kind of own the success of the board and the organization, rather than it's just the executive director trying to do this and the board trying to come along. I think the more people are engaged at that level, it helps. That's my own perspective as a board member.
I'm curious, you guys, like, as you think about dealing with COVID and dealing with fundraising and having conversations with your board about, you know, the impact of this current environment, what are you seeing that is working and what isn't working? Are you guys seeing some things where it's gone well, or any ideas you want to share?
Yeah.
There's a great comment in the chat. Would love to hear from you, Lawrence, too. But in a second, Brenda posted a little bit about their use of the Carver model for policy governance. And that was kind of more on the micromanaging front. But would be curious to hear from you, Brenda, if you feel like unmuting and jumping in. But Lawrence, I know that you've had your hand raised for a while, so would love to hear what you're thinking.
Yeah, I think really it's all about the leadership. I'm a volunteer for a very small organization. We have an exceptional leader who comes all the way back from the civil rights movement. She's getting to retire. She's working with everybody, but everybody gets together with her at her house. She sets the tone. This is what our organization is about. Everybody chips in. They just created an honorary board for people who are the best volunteers now, and some people in the past. And after the first meeting, one of the volunteers went to their organization and got $2,000 for Microsoft. So I think it's really about the leadership. The board wants the executive director to succeed, and the executive director has got to make sure that he or she is giving appropriate credit to the board for making this all work together. So it's leadership and communication.
Yeah, and a great reminder to say thank you.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah.
And recognizing, maybe when you say that, I'm just thinking with one organization, we found ways to recognize and thank our volunteers too, because sometimes we overlook, you know, saying thank you, like you say, whether it's to the board or your volunteers, but sometimes volunteers make a big difference too. Well, in most cases, they make a big difference too.
So Brenda, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, so I'll just give you a little bit of a background. I started with this organization called the Volunteer Center in the South Bay. Right about the same time we were hiring a new CEO. And just as Carolyn said earlier, the previous CEO had been in place for almost 30 years. There were big shoes to fill. And so when the CEO started, the board was in a state of being more of a supportive board. So the executive director really ran the show, and the board said bravo, and and that was really pretty much it. Bringing in a new CEO with the level of savvy or skill set as the prior CEO, and I then became board chair elect. I was just kind of watching everything play out and was saying we need to have better governance in place. The CEO, as a new CEO, was very concerned with micromanaging. And the current board was looking at changes being made, saying that's not the way we used to do it. So, so then when we, as board chair elect, we had a full year where we really studied the Carver model of policy governance that really delineated the authority of the board versus the authority of the CEO, and really established those two domains. So the board understood that their role was to be an agent for the community that we serve, and to make sure that the organization was meeting the impact and results that our programs were supposed to have in the community. And that the board CEO was responsible for implementing or the means that were associated with those ends. So we pretty much started to delineate it in that manner, and that pretty much, we started having really good conversations about, is that an end or is that a mean? Mm-hmm. So that language helped us to create this culture where we weren't overstepping the CEO, but really supporting the CEO.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great way to test,
Yes.
right? As people are struggling with staying in your lane.
Or even
Yes.
or even helping the board understand its role. Some boards don't, or some CEOs don't, their expectations are beyond what the board should be doing, So yeah, just even helping the board, having that training. I think it's a training required. Yeah.
So, Erin, should we, do you want to do chat for 5 minutes or do you want to do breakout? Carolyn, I really want to thank you. I know we're keeping you over. Erin, Carolyn, we can let you go because I know you're supposed to be at an event right now.
Right.
But thank
Organization
you.
I'm on the board of.
There you go, competing board responsibilities. Thank
Right.
you for sharing all your ideas and perspective today. It's really valuable.
And I just want to give a shout out to all the EDs, because I think being an ED is hard work. One of the things I always say is, I don't think I could be an ED, because you got the staff and you've got the board and you've got all these things that you're managing. And I think just working with the board sometimes is maybe one of the toughest roles that you have. So I want to acknowledge you for what you do in making our community work and for taking on that challenge. So my shout out and my hats off to you. So I will see you soon, I hope. All right. Thank you, Regina.
Thank you so much.
All right. Take care,
All
everybody.
right.
Carolyn. Regina, to your question, I think that we might have run out of time to do a full breakout as this conversation just kept going, but maybe we'd continue here for just a few more minutes. One of the topics that came up in the poll that we have yet to discuss is the board's role in calls for racial equity. And I'd be curious if anybody wanted to, jump in and talk about their experiences either from the board side or from the executive side. But this could obviously cover a lot of different ground, from internal equity in an organization, externally, how you're interacting with your community and the services you provide. And as this was, I think, the third highest requested, reported thing here. Would be really curious if anyone has experiences to discuss, or if Regina, if you felt like sharing a little bit from the CNN experience. But I would be bummed if we ended this call without talking about that.
I guess to Erin's point, I'm curious, is it coming up in your board meetings? Are you guys finding that it's an agenda item, or is there a thumbs up or a thumbs down?
Well, we have we at the Volunteer Center, a piece of a major chunk of our organization works with the courts in the South Bay. And so when someone has community service, they've had a misdemeanor, they get community service. Our organization matches those individuals with volunteer opportunities, usually different city or civic organizations that like cleaning up the parks and things of that nature. So we'll match them with that opportunity, and then we do the paperwork to get them cleared by the courts. And so what we've been talking about in our organization is really discussing the inequity in that system, because the majority of the people who we're seeing coming through the door are minorities. And so we want to highlight more in this heightened awareness of social injustice, to highlight and make aware of the fact that we are providing a service because we're giving a reduced rate to these individuals when they get to that state. So we're trying to really make the volunteer center's activities or actions in that space more visible or understood by even the individuals who come through our doors, that giving them a sense of resiliency and encouraging empathy in their, we call it volunteering more so than, this time that you're having to serve. And so really trying to change that narrative in our community is one of the things we're finding is critical now during these times.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm curious if anybody else has a different approach, how your board is talking and thinking about it. I'll share with you a couple of things that we've been doing on our team, not with our clients, but with ourselves. For the past 7 years, we have been kind of making it a staff meeting agenda item, where it takes on different forms, but we have a committee of our staff that is interested in the topic, has been interested for a long time. They're a diverse group. And sometimes that means they find a YouTube video they'll ask everybody to take a look at and talk about. Sometimes it's a book. Sometimes we bring in a speaker to help us work through our own biases. So that can be, an exercise over a couple of hours that's really just lets people talk about what's on their minds and things they need to understand about themselves and others. So we've gone at it from a lot of different ways over time. But I can tell you that was then, and this is now. And up until I would say the early part of 2020, I would have been able to tell you I'm really proud of the fact that we've made it a regular part of our conversations at CNM, some experiential, some kind of intellectual. I'm not so sure that that's sufficient at a time when so much is so raw. And so just from the sort of leadership perspective, I've found it really humbling to try and figure out how to be respectful and to admit, like you were saying, we're not always sure we're doing anything right. But what, as I've asked folks that have been in this space for a long time, what they've told me is doing nothing is the only thing wrong, right? That to admit that you have no clue, because this is not, we didn't get here quickly, we're not going to get out of here quickly, and however you define it. But the most important thing is that your team feels like, let's commit to wanting to understand each other better and to talk more without judgment, and try and provide schools and safe space to do that. But even that stretches muscles that stress people out. And you never know what it's going to trigger for people. So I have been humbled in 2020 for as much as we've tried, how long the climb is. But a colleague of ours who works with CNM told us last spring, think of it like the time it took you to get through elementary school, right? That over years, first you learned how to write letters, and then you learned to craft words, and then you learned to read, and then you learned to interpret words. And that, if you have some patience with yourselves about that, you can have some more openness. So I don't know, Aaron, if you would say we handled things differently, but hopefully any of this might be useful for you guys.
Lisa, did you want to chime in?
Sure. I encourage everybody to take a look at their local community college. I work at Chafee College Foundation. We're an interdisciplinary we're like a interdependent nonprofit affiliated with the college. And they've been having a lot of town halls and a lot of open sessions that are open to the community, where you can zoom in. Dr. Solorzano has been doing amazing workshops on microaggressions, because people don't realize the little things that they say that are setting other people off, or, those are just the nuances. But he also talks about microaffirmations, which are kind of the opposite, ways that we can be respectful and honor people's culture. But a lot of the community colleges, who usually seem very insular, have been opening these up to the broader community, and that's what we've been doing at Chafee. Plus, we have diverse faculty. I worked really hard to create a very diverse board that wasn't diverse when I got there 6 years ago, not just, by diversity in terms of ethnicity, but also our makeup in terms of female and male. We had very, very small number of female on our board, but the faculty bring things to the forefront that the board is very responsive to. We have a social justice scholarship that was created. We're calling it the Black Minds Matter Endowment, but it's open to all students. And that was important for the board to understand that, because as being tied to the college, it's part of Prop 209, but the opportunity to provide education is just so critical, to share with them what we're doing and why we're doing it to support all of our students, but to let them know that there's resources within the college that are open to the broader community and the broader constituency. So it's a safe way to learn more and to kind of ignite a conversation about those topics that are so critical to those of us who are not just, because it's really, really important, not just for our people of color to have the opportunity, but, for our white counterpart and constituents to feel like they're part of the solution and to be embracing of every culture and to remind people to be that way. So I encourage you to look at your local community college, because most likely they're having open Zoom meetings and Zoom sessions. They're calling town hall meetings that are a great way to provide resources to your board members and to your staff. And it's usually free.
That's a great reminder, Lisa. And you reminded me that there are so many conversations going on around the community, and thanks to Zoom, you can be part of them and zoom in and out, right?
Yep.
And then on the board governance conversation side, I know the board source has stuff on their website that you can borrow and have access to as well, about how to start conversations. So, just kudos to all of you for spending this time on all of this. We know you have your hands full. We're really glad that you joined us for this time, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks. We're really excited about our every other Friday time with you guys, because we get to talk about whatever comes up for all of you. So Aaron, you want to call it? Thanks though, Lisa. Good idea. And thanks, Brenda, for sharing.
Yeah, thank you all for sharing and for joining us and for sticking on for the full hour. I think that's pretty much a wrap. And as ever, we'll be posting, the video of this call on our YouTube channel, so anybody else can check it out. But hope everyone has a good rest of the day and a safe and healthy weekend.
Thanks, Aaron. Bye, everybody.
Awesome. Thank you all.